Good afternoon. I'm Tony Dubiel. I'm going to give you a really brief demonstration of using Ansible resource modules to manage drift control. What you see here is the Ansible Automation Platform, and this is a workflow. If you're not familiar with a workflow, effectively all it really is the ability to orchestrate automation by stitching together multiple playbooks and what to do on pass, fail, and always conditions, as well as other features such as approval nodes so that we can bring in a human into the loop to review. In this case, we're going to do a drift check. So ultimately, we're going to use resource modules to do diff comparisons between the devices running configuration and what we establish on the front end as our source of truth, or otherwise what we call the intended configuration. Once we review that configuration and we feel comfortable to move forward, then the next step is to apply that configuration to the actual devices. In terms of devices and source of truth, let's take a look at that real quick. And what you notice here is that I have these three routers. Router 1 is a Cisco router. 2 and 4 are both Arista routers. If I click into here, you can see that I've collected a configuration with multiple YAML files based off of the existing configuration on the Cisco device. So we've gathered these configurations, we've created these YAML files based off of all of the resource modules that map to the configuration on that Cisco device. For the actual playbook, drift.yaml, what I've done here is I've created a variable called resource, and I've listed out only the resource modules that I actually want to test here today. So this is just a subset or a sampling of what was available for that particular device. And then for a task, basically what we're doing is we're iterating through that list and we're calling those roles. So in terms of the roles, let's go ahead and take a look at those. So the first one here is logging global. So let me open that one up. And if I go to the task, you can see what we're doing in terms of the playbook task. So for the task in this role, what I'm doing is I am able to manage resource modules across vendors in a multi-vendor way by using the netcommon.network resource or _resource module. So what that does is it takes out the need for me to explicitly call out the specific module for the logging global for Cisco and then create a separate task for the module for Arista. It does that for me in terms of making a decision based off of the OS name. So the Ansible _network OS in this case is either the iOS or Cisco.iOS or the Arista.eos. When it reads that in from the variables, here we're calling host vars. So host vars gives us access to the group vars as well as the host vars that have either been explicitly created in these host vars or the group vars that I've created in my inventory that is configured in the automation platform. By accessing that, I can determine, okay, this is a Cisco device, this is an Arista device, use the appropriate module. So that's orchestrated for us. And then the second side of this is what state do we want to use? So state is how we apply the module. In this case, the state will be overridden. So it'll show me configs that don't exist on the device that need to be added from my intended configuration, as well as configurations that have been previously added to the device, but not using my source of truth. In other words, for example, if we were to use command line and access that device out of band, we may have made some changes that we're unaware of on that configuration that we declared up front, in this case in our host vars, that we're managing in a Git source control. So from that, I can run a task in run mode, which is the default, or check mode. When I run a task in check mode, it runs the module in a checked mode that's effectively basically the same thing as a dry run, right? So it tells me what would change, but it doesn't actually apply any changes to the device. So this will tell me or give me insights into the device's configuration. And then from that, I can use the utils collection with the fact underscore diff module to compare the before, which is that configuration that I gleaned and gathered for the resource module from that device. In this case, for the logging configuration, because resource modules are scoped. So in this case, we're only talking about logging, but then I have the additional roles to look at SNMP and NTP and interfaces, right? But it's all similar in the sense that we just pull that very scope configuration, and then the after is comparing it to the host vars file, right? That we pull down from our repo, our Git repo, into the AAP, and we're comparing against that. So that's our intended configuration. So any diffs from the device versus what's running in tenant configuration will surface from running this task. And we only run this task when this variable diffs is equal to true. So that would populate this right here for the diff parameter. So we can see the diffs on the screen as output when we run this playbook as part of the workflow. Now, the reason why I set that parameter to be on or off is because when I run this in check mode, I want to see the diffs. When I run this the second time after the approval, after the review, I want to run it in run mode, and there's no need to see the diffs at that time. I only want to see the output of the module actually making the change to the logging configuration. So that'll make more sense when we start to see that on the screens. So without further ado, let's go ahead and make some out-of-band changes so we can detect the drift of those. So on router 1, the Cisco, let's go ahead and add a few things that shouldn't be there. So we have an interface LO0, loopback 0. Let's add a description. It's an oops. Should not be there. Let's go ahead and add NTP server. So let's exit out of that. All right, and I'm just creating an arbitrary IP address for that server. Right, and then something else that we could do is logging. Add a logging host that shouldn't be there. Right, so there's some configs that shouldn't be there for router 1. Let's go ahead and add a few things to the other routers. Router 2, the Arista router. Let's do SNMP server, community, oops, read only. So that's good for that one. We have a change. Oops, I think it's, let me quit. And then we want to go to router 4, which is also Arista. And we'll do an interface change again. Oops. Okay, so we made some changes here. We should detect those changes when we run the workflow. So we'll go ahead and kick off the workflow. Let's refresh this session so I don't have to re-log in. And the first thing is the drift check. All right, so let's scroll up here. So the first thing we looked at was logging, and we had changed a logging host on router 1. So this is actually that resource module. And what you'll notice from a resource module is it tells us the commands that it needs to add or remove, because we're running this with the state of overridden. So it wants to remove the bad or the incorrect logging host. So if we look at the before, we actually had the correct configuration in here up until a point. So all this was good. But when we added that host, that is not in compliance with our source of truth in those host vars files. So if we look at the after, it's the exact same thing. Now the reason for that is because when we ran that resource module for the logging, we ran it in check mode. So even though we have a state of overridden, it was in check mode. So we didn't actually override that configuration. right? But it gave us insights into the configuration. So where that actually happened was, if I look at the details of how we ran this job template, which manages the playbook, we have the state of overridden, but the check mode is true. And diffs are true, so we'll see the diffs also on the output. So let's go ahead and scroll down. And this is the diff. So the before is the running config on the Cisco device, and the after is our intended config. The ones in black are configs that are the exact same, so it's just for context to show us where something starts and ends. So this is where we added that incorrect logging server, and that was for router 1. As we move down, we also changed NTP, so very similar to what we did with logging. It wouldn't make that change, but it will show us that we have this incorrect NTP server running on the device, and this is correct configurations. If I click into here, we'll see the no command, right, to remove the incorrect one, right? So same thing as we saw before. And then moving down for SNMP on router 2, we can see that we had before, right, with all of these commands. But we have this community oops that's in there. So the after is the exact same because this is in check mode, right? But what we want to do, or what we need to do to reconcile this, is remove this community of oops. That shouldn't be there, right? So the diffs gives us the ability to review what's been added, the things that are different. If there's not a diff, then we don't have anything changed and we wouldn't have anything populated in here. And then we just move down, and as we went through, we also went into router 4. It made changes at the bottom too, so that's this one here. This is where we added another description of oops, right? So this just gives us the ability to check and then make a decision. So having said that, if I go back into the workflow, we are waiting here for an approval. So we can click the button here, or we could use the REST API from northbound of the AAP for someone that has credentials to make this approval, right? So I'm admin, so I have credential, or I have the proper privilege level to do that, or a user that's been assigned roles-based access to have access to this. Other examples could be something like a ServiceNow or other catalog that can access this button remotely through the API and through the collection, so like running a playbook to do the same thing. We're going to go ahead and approve it. And when we approve it, we'll notice that that will kick off running effectively the same playbook, but this time in run mode, with a couple of the extra variables that, or one extra variable in particular, right? The diffs is false, so we shouldn't see them on the screen, and check mode is false. And then we had that parameter or a conditional in our role to say if diffs are false, then there's no reason to run the diff task. So we'll go back to the job output, and it finished. So let's go ahead and click into a couple of these. So this time we notice that we don't see any diffs because of our conditional, and that conditional was back here because only when diffs are true. So that's how that worked. And then if I click in this first one for logging, it looks just like it did before. We want to remove the logging host, but we'll notice that the before has our config that's good, but then we have the one that needs to be removed. But this time in the after, we have removed that entry, right? And that's because we have the state of overridden, and we applied that this time. So you'll notice that's the same thing with these other ones. So there's NTP. Let's pick on this SNMP on router 2. So the same thing here is we want to remove this community, right? Community of oops. It exists in the before. Oops, I meant to highlight it. It exists before, but does not exist in the after. In the same thing. When we invoked it with a state of overridden, right? So that concludes our workflow and our demonstration Thanks for joining us, and I look forward to seeing you on the next one.